It's often very hard to work with people when you're trying to produce or mix a song or something like that if they don't trust you. Ultimately, they need to trust you, whether it's just a collaboration or whatever, because you could have an idea that could be great, but if they're not willing to trust you, it doesn't matter how good your idea is. They're never going to be willing to go down that path of trying it. So a big thing I think most artists should consider is they should be willing to try things. If they're not willing to do that, there's no point in hiring anyone to do anything for you. You should just do it all yourself. So if you are open-minded enough to trust people, you can get things to happen that might be much better than you could have ever imagined on your own. That's the benefit of having someone with experience come in and work on your project. I'll give you a good example from a video here where Rich Costey is talking to Andrew Sheps on the Puremix channel. It's an amazing interview, and I wanted to look this up because I just talked about how Audio Slave's first album sounded particularly amazing. And that's an album that was produced by Rick Rubin, mixed by Rich Costey. And this dude mixes tons of stuff that you probably know. So look him up if you want to see some credits. That guy does a lot. And amazing sounding stuff. If you listen to that Audio Slave record, I mean, the first one sounds phenomenal. But anyway, so check this out. Fair use for teaching purposes, fair use for teaching purposes.
I sat out production on a couple of Muse albums, and I got back in the saddle with them on this most recent album, and Matt and I had dinner, and he said that I'm a disruptor. He said that I go and disrupt everything that the band is doing, and he said, and he thinks it's in a good way. I happen to disrupt them in a way that works for them, most of the time or whenever we do it. I don't necessarily feel that I'm a disruptor, although I have done that occasionally, like really someone's flow because I'm trying to get at something,
Right.
There's a UK band, Biffy Clyro. I did the new album, which is going to come out soon. It's great. Everybody buy it. And the previous album, Ellipsis, when we started that album, the first day we worked on a track called Wolves of Winter, which ended up being the first song on the album. And I had just gotten the Fairlight. So I just wanted to use the Fairlight on everything because it's the new shiny piece of equipment in the room. Fairlight is like a really interesting 80s sampling keyboard.
Thomas Dolby, if anyone wants to hear a Fairlight. Well, and Peter Gabriel. There you go.
All that, yeah. And, we were recording a live band, and then I was like, I had this idea that I wanted the kick to have that Fairlight sound. I wanted it to have that pocket, and I wanted everything to be shaped around that sound. I wanted the sound of that to inform every other decision that we made. So after I got a take of the drums, we edited together. We made a MIDI track of the kick drum, triggered the Fairlight, and I had him go back in and replay the drums without playing the kick drum. Oh, and because I wanted to be able to crank the room mics, I had him not play the cymbals. So Ben's out there and he's got he can't use his kick drum and he can't use his cymbals. And this is the first day in the room with me. And he's just like, what the is going on? You know what I mean? But it came out great, and then the whole middle section, the song kind of breaks down for the chorus. That's all Fairlight programming. And that wouldn't have sounded the same if we were using Ableton or something like that. It has an aesthetic and informs every other decision that you're making. It's not the quickest way to make albums. But obviously, for some reason, I've never been accused of making an album too quickly.
Well, I don't think anybody has really, but it's really interesting how you'll take a band. I mean, in Biffy, I mean, they're a heavy band, and I don't know their catalog that well, but I don't think anyone would say they're a super experimental proggy heavy band. They're just a heavy band. So
they
that's
have some experimental side to them for sure. Yeah, they are interested in some weird shit for sure.
Right.
But sonically, not so much. They're definitely more about salt of the earth.
Yeah. But so to go down that road on day one is it's bold, and I'm sure it didn't even occur. You weren't thinking I'm going to show them what I'm about. Just it's this song and I want this. And
that didn't even cross my mind. I had lunch last winter with Frank Turner, who's another UK artist that I've worked with, and he was talking about the process of working with me. Now, his album, that was the quickest production I'd made in, 15, 20 years. We recorded the whole thing in, I think, 4 or 5 weeks. And he said that I spent a day and a half listening to cymbals because they hated all the cymbals that they brought with them. And so we rented a bunch and I spent a day and a half I don't remember that, but it doesn't surprise me.
See, that's the good part about your brain is it blacked it out for you. But that's amazing. Out of 28 days.
Didn't blacken up Frank's memory, unfortunately.
No, but I love out of what a 31-day project, a day and a half of that cymbals.
I just hate cymbals. I just hate them, you know? When
Well,
you get them right, they sound really good. But if you get them wrong, it's just a white noise generator that obscures everything else you're trying to do.
there's a great article that needed some proofreading, some weird typos in it though, but I think it was on through the Grammy site, and it was about Peter Gabriel's fourth solo record. There's just a lot of people talking about it, but that was his thing going into that record when he met Steve Lillywhite, and they're like, "So, what's your vision for this record?" No cymbals. That was it. And there is not a single cymbal. And Jerry Murata's talking about it and about how at first it really freaked him out, and then within about an hour, he'd kind of figured it out. And it wasn't we're going to cut the cymbals separate. It was, this record has to work with no cymbals. And they're a real crutch, man. I mean, I will fly crash cymbal samples into mixes when I cannot get the downbeat of a section to work. Like, I know what'll do it. And so to go after an entire record that way, it's bold. But yes, cymbals, as great a job as they do when they're doing their thing, are a nightmare for every other aspect of their existence, I think.
Another, on the same thing, the My Bloody Valentine album, Loveless, there's no hi-hat on that whole album. You know, I don't know if that was a conscious choice of theirs, or Kevin was just like, I hate hi-hats, don't put, as they went. But I remember noticing that years ago. I'm a huge fan of that album, and there was not a single hi-hat on there.
Right. Funny.
Weird.
Yeah, and Queens, cutting them separate because you got to be able to control them.
Yeah.
But then there are a million bands that will cut the drums separate that way, but it takes a special kind of drummer to be able to do it too. Like, you don't do that, so then you edit everything.
A lot of bands wind up doing that sort of a recording process where they do the cymbals afterwards, cut them separately, so that the drums can really shine. They can bloom and blossom without this white noise generator over everything. Anybody who knows me knows I hate cymbals. I hate them unless they are played a very certain way. And if you're a drummer, I happen to play drums sometimes. I wouldn't call myself a drummer, but in a studio situation, I can get it done. And I've gotten it done on recordings before. But the point is, the way I play drums is very specific because I am also an engineer. I'm also a guy who mixes stuff. So at the end of the day, I know that if the cymbals are played loudly, everything sucks. And if the cymbals are not, then it works. So I play cymbals sparingly and lightly because I know what I don't want is the whoosh whoosh. And everybody who's a drummer, who's like a friend of mine, knows I talk about this all the time. And I'm always like, what's with the whoosh whoosh? And when I hear a freaking band playing in a small room and all you hear is cymbals, it's like, who cares about all these crashes you're putting in the song? Nobody can hear the song. The singer's voice is like too low to be heard. Everything else is taking a back seat to these freaking crash cymbals. So it's just so funny to me when people it's like you can't play like you're in a stadium. And in a stadium, because there's so much space around everything, it's like that's in their head where they think they are when they're playing in a small room, not realizing a small room has going to bank off all the walls. And it's like you get so much more out of the cymbal than you want. So you can't play like you're in a stadium. You have to play for the room you're in. And when you're on a recording, it's a very commonly known thing that if you can play a little bit lighter and allows you to turn the preamps up, you get a thicker sound. And if you happen to be a guy who hits hard, just playing less cymbals or lighter on the cymbals than you're playing on the drums, like you got to control your own mix of your hits. And if you don't, you got to separate them. That's like Queens of the Stone Age and why their drums sound so good. And what else did he say? He's like, you can't do that with every drummer. Some drummers cannot change what they're doing and it will ruin everything because you don't want to do that and then edit everything later. So as the guy who's in charge of producing, you know, he needs to also understand who he's with. He can't just apply the same logic to everyone because some people can't cut it. And you don't want to be editing later. You don't do that kind of thing without the cymbals so that you can edit it later. It's a disastrous nightmare. They need to be able to play without them. And then when they add them in, it needs to all lock together in the right place. They're not doing that so they can shift everything. They gotta shift it or it sounds terrible. So there's a lot to this, but if you can play lighter on things that are just white noise generators like cymbals, you do way, way, way better. But like I said, the band's got to trust the producer. They got to trust. It's just the same way on a mixer. Like if the mixer gives you the song and it sounds, he's saying it sounds great, and you're listening thinking, oh, like you're just listening to your instrument, whether it's your vocal or the guitar. If it's a guitarist, listening to the guitars, or the drummer listening to the drums. Very common. The band all listens to their own instrument, which will kill a mix so quick if the band doesn't understand what has to happen in a mix, which means certain things shine and then other things shine, and there's like this push and pull. It's not a game of everything needs to be the loudest thing in the mix the entire time. That doesn't work. It doesn't give you a good mix. And sometimes your drums could be clearly heard in one part. You hear the kick and snare super clear. And then in another part, maybe it's the guitar solo that's shining and you don't need to hear the kick and snare super clear. It's this push and pull. So that's the biggest problem when you're dealing with bands that don't trust the result and the mixer. They need to understand it can't just listen to their own part and judge this thing. You got to judge it from a perspective that's a distant perspective, listening to the whole mix as a whole. You have to. That's the way you get a good mix, because every great mix has this push-pull. It's a very common thing on all the guys that came up in the Rick Rubin camp, this mentality of slippery fader, he calls it, where he basically will make stuff a little bit louder to show itself and just pop into frame and be like, hey, I'm here. Then it gets lowered down and you don't even realize it's not there anymore. It's just, your just brain associates, you heard it, you assume it's there, even though it's ducking down and getting out of the way after it showed itself. It's a very popular technique in a lot of Rick Rubin's stuff that he produces that other people mix. That's something that he would instruct them to do or just talk about, and then they would wind up doing. Rich Costey does it all the time. This kind of thing where certain different elements shine in different places of the song. It's not the same volume throughout. There's things that are there, then they disappear, and you hardly ever know they disappear, especially stuff like shakers or tambourines. There's no reason for that to run the top of the volume spectrum in a track. It's just, it might show itself, and then it ducks down, and you don't even realize it, because nobody's sitting there listening to that intently, just that. They're listening to the mix. And that's what the listeners are doing. So once you start to mix in this way, it's a real disaster when a band comes in and then goes the other way on you, where they're like, oh, well, you know, the snare seems a little lower here than it is here. It's like, you don't understand the game, man. You know, and that's the point. So I hope you guys got something from it, because this whole interview is great. I'll put a link to it in the description. I hope you guys check that out. But you know, Rich Costey is one of my favorite mixers there is. And the dude's worked with Muse, Foo Fighters. I mean, he's done tons of stuff. So anyway, you guys got this. Keep that in mind. And when you're mixing, everything should not be the static same volume. And even on the total mix bus, like the 2 bus, I'm talking about after you're processing. In other words, not before, because when you're on after the processing, so any processing you have going on after that, you may want to automate certain things louder than others. For example, if some part gets super dense, it could actually feel quieter than the part before it. If the part before it was more sparse and open, it might feel like that's louder if you don't, you know, put automation on that, the final 2 bus. After your processing. So what you do is you just automate up the chorus, let's say, and maybe you need to automate everything down a dB or so, sometimes even a little more than a dB. Just automate everything down so that you can automate the chorus up to that 0 mark. And that's the point where, as you're going through and listening, now the chorus hits and it gets louder rather than it going the other way. CLA talks about that. A lot of people who mix wind up, everything's going backwards. It's like as it gets, you should be getting bigger and louder, it gets smaller because it's more dense and now it's eating up the compression and everything more. That's why you do it afterwards. Because if you did it before the compression, all you're doing is driving into the compression harder, making the compressor work harder. Whereas if you do it afterwards, then it's making it louder after the compression. You get a much bigger result per move afterwards rather than when you're driving into the compression more. It could just be creating more ducking when you're doing that. And you don't want to be doing that. So you do it after. That's the move. You put it on your final bus. So in other words, if everything's getting fed through your 2-bus chain, that gets to a bus. That's the bus you automate and you print from that. That's the move. Okay. So I hope this made some sense. Hope you guys dig it. All right. Tons more to come. Leave a comment. I appreciate it very much. Hit the subscribe button. I also appreciate that. Hit the like button. Talk to you guys soon. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.